The door closed behind her, and for the first time in what felt like years, the air around me seemed to exhale along with me. The coffee shop buzzed on, oblivious to the small but decisive drama that had just played out in one corner. I stirred my coffee, but the warmth was no longer the only comfort. There was a stillness, a quiet victory in the ordinary. The world had continued without spectacle. My world had continued with clarity I hadn't known I was capable of. Elena tilted her head, her eyes curious but patient. "You okay?" she asked again, gently probing without pushing. I nodded, smiling just slightly. This smile was different. It wasn't performative. It wasn't meant to reassure anyone but myself. "Yeah," I said, finally. "Everything's okay." And it was. The past had been catalogued, boxed, and removed. Its echoes might linger in the periphery of memory, but they had no power here. I had stepped into a life that was mine entirely. A life built on decisions, not obligations, not performance, not someone else's expectation of what I should be. I reached for my laptop, opened it, and the familiar hum of the processor grounded me. The diagram on the napkin from earlier still smudged my fingers, lines of firewalls and access points that now seemed to symbolize far more than network security. They were the boundaries I had drawn, the fences that defined where I ended and the past began. Elena leaned closer, interested, laughing quietly at my poor rendition of digital architecture. Her laughter was a melody untied from tension. It was the first sound I'd truly heard in weeks that belonged to joy and not to anxiety, guilt, or obligation. We worked through the morning in this comfortable bubble of normality, and as I explained a particularly tricky concept about intrusion detection, I felt the final tether snap. Chloe was a figure of the past now, a cautionary tale about clarity, boundaries, and self-respect. I realized that leaving hadn't been about punishment. It had been about claiming myself. The silence I had cultivated in Jake's spare room, the hours spent learning and growing, the deliberate withdrawal from a life that had miscast me, those things weren't acts of cruelty. They were acts of survival. I thought back to the apartment, to the last night of moving, the empty kitchen counter with the note and the key. That final gesture, simple and precise, had been the true closure. There had been no drama, no speeches, no televised heartbreak, just a statement of fact, an unyielding boundary drawn in ink. And as Chloe stumbled through her subsequent attempts, calls, messages, voicemails, there had been nothing to pierce that boundary. My calm, deliberate silence had been louder than any argument I could have made. Months passed. The small, sunlit apartment became more than a shelter. It became a home. Coffee in the morning, study sessions, quiet evenings spent reading technical manuals or reviewing security modules online. Progress was incremental, not dramatic, but in that incremental accumulation lay a kind of triumph I had never anticipated. I had learned that the self isn't reclaimed in a moment of confrontation or vindication. It is reclaimed quietly, carefully, moment by moment. Each step, each decision, each day of refusing to reinsert myself into her narrative built something unshakable. The outside world, as it turns out, didn't need to see the drama unfold. Chloe's reunion debacle, her attempts to frame me in absentia, her attempts at manipulation, they were immaterial. Validation was unnecessary. The quiet, methodical construction of my life, the deliberate cultivation of independence and competence, was enough. I had freed myself from the theater of her ego. The audience I once cared about no longer mattered. My satisfaction didn't come from watching her unravel. It came from stepping fully into a life that was undeniably mine. One evening, after a long session of studying network protocols, I paused, feeling the sunlight on my desk, the hum of the laptop, the faint aroma of coffee. It hit me with gentle force. I had arrived at a place of genuine peace. Not the absence of challenge, not the avoidance of discomfort, but the presence of control. The control to choose what mattered, the control to choose who to let into my life, the control to invest in growth, curiosity, and real connections. Elena remained a companion in that journey, not a replacement, not a consolation, but a reminder that relationships could exist outside of performance and expectation. We shared laughs, frustrations about coursework, observations about the absurdity of the digital security world. There was no script, there was no obligation, just presence. Chloe eventually faded entirely from my routine. The messages stopped, the calls ceased. When I looked out my apartment window onto the city below, I realized she had become like a shadow behind a glass door, visible in memory, but no longer part of the room I inhabited. I had discovered that the best way to teach someone the weight of their words isn't confrontation, it's the act of fully living without them. By the 6-month mark, my life had transformed quietly but completely. A framed certificate for my cloud security certification hung on the wall. A modest promotion at work acknowledged my competence. Friends like Leo and Elena filled my social landscape with laughter and authenticity. My mornings were purposeful. My evenings were deliberate. Peace wasn't something I had waited for. It was something I had earned. Piece by piece, boundary by boundary. Sometimes I thought of Chloe, her past performances and her words, and felt a flicker of the old pain, but it was a distant echo. The truth had settled in me. Leaving wasn't cruelty. It wasn't malice. It was clarity. And in that clarity, I had found freedom. I raised my coffee cup one morning in silent acknowledgement to the journey from embarrassment, manipulation, and expectation to calm, focus, and control. This was life as it should be, unencumbered, deliberate, and fully my own. And as I sipped, I knew there would be no rewrites, no reprises, no curtain calls. The performance was over. The audience had departed. I remained, whole, grounded, and finally at peace. Weeks melted into months. The quiet I'd carved out became a steady rhythm, a pulse of possibility beneath my skin. I woke earlier, lingered over coffee in the sunlit corner of my apartment, and let the city hum around me instead of through me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was profoundly ordinary. And in that ordinariness, I found clarity. Chloe's words, her sneers, her whispered embarrassing, were now echoes in a canyon I had no intention of returning to. Elena and I grew into a steady companionship, platonic, sharp, and entirely real. We debated algorithms, dissected network breaches, laughed at our shared disdain for the more absurd corners of corporate IT life. For the first time in years, my social energy wasn't spent performing, managing, or diffusing. It was spent simply being. I remembered how that felt, the small joys of genuine conversation, and I refused to apologize for reclaiming it. My certification completed, I held it like a talisman on the wall of my apartment. Security analyst, no air quotes. My work had meaning beyond a paycheck. I was building something of my own, an identity uncolored by Chloe's insecurities or expectations. Promotions came, small but steady, each one reinforcing a simple truth. Progress comes from consistent effort, not borrowed validation. Chloe attempted to reinsert herself into my orbit several more times, each attempt a masterclass in human predictability. The first came via text, weeks after the coffee shop encounter. "Mark, I think we need to talk. I was wrong. Can we meet?" I did not respond. Another call from an unknown number, soft and desperate. "You're being cold. Don't do this. I can fix it." I stared at the screen and let it ring out. Nothing she said had any power. The power belonged to the life I was building, not the chaos she wished to impose. The universe seemed to nod with quiet approval. Friends I hadn't realized I'd neglected checked in. Leo became a regular presence again, sharing beers and laughter with no hidden agenda. Elena and I brainstormed on side projects. My time felt expansive, full of intention. I discovered the small pleasures that had gone missing under the weight of a performative relationship. The first sip of coffee that wasn't shared, a sunny Saturday spent debugging code with no one watching, the meditative rhythm of daily routines. Chloe's presence became a ghost story. Derek's occasional messages were curiosity, not concern, and I treated them clinically, data points, not drama. I kept the apartment key and the note as relics, digital and physical, cataloged evidence of a chapter concluded. I didn't burn bridges, I simply reclassified them. They no longer belonged to my narrative. Then came the day when closure presented itself in its purest form. My phone buzzed with a muted notification. A group message, muted, in the style of catching up. Chloe's name floated in the corner of my screen. I tapped it open briefly, an old habit of curiosity, but it was clear. She had reached out, not to reconcile, not to understand, but to apologize in a way that demanded recognition of my continued presence in her life. I read it once, stored it in the archive folder of my mind, and deleted it. There was nothing left for her to take from me. I didn't respond because silence was more eloquent than anything I could type. My reflection shifted fully into forward motion. I began mentoring junior analysts at work, relishing in the transmission of knowledge for the first time without the need for personal accolades. Elena and I collaborated on a small project for fun, a sandbox app for network testing, and celebrated each milestone quietly with a shared lunch or coffee. There was laughter without performance. There was focus without distraction. There was life in a form that required no masks. The apartment, once a battlefield, was now a sanctuary. Books lined the walls in precise but comfortable chaos, each one a fragment of my own curiosity. My music played softly in the evenings. The sunlight shifted across the floor, painting patterns I actually noticed. For the first time, I lived for the details. They were mine. Chloe had been a storm. I had become the calm afterward. Occasionally I thought of her, not with anger, not with longing, but with an anthropologist's detached interest. How had someone I once loved transformed into a performance for her peers? How had the word embarrassing carried the power to reshape my entire life, only for me to reclaim that narrative entirely? The answers were irrelevant. I was no longer a participant in her story. My story, the one I had rebuilt, was authored by clarity, diligence, and a relentless commitment to myself. The final subtle victory was internal, peace. Not a loud, triumphant relief, but a steady, grounding certainty. Each morning reinforced it, each small accomplishment, each intentional choice layered upon the last. The past existed in memory, but memory no longer dictated motion. I had learned the most critical lesson. Withdrawal is not defeat, it is strategy. And in my quiet, deliberate withdrawal, I had discovered something more powerful than any plea or apology: autonomy. One evening, sipping coffee by my window, laptop closed, the hum of the city below, I smiled. Not at someone else, not at a relationship or a performance, but at myself. I was whole, entirely my own, and ready for what was next. The word embarrassing now floated like an empty echo, impotent, irrelevant. The life I had reclaimed was real. It was quiet. It was mine. And in that quiet, I finally understood the weightlessness of freedom. Thanks for watching. If you've ever had to leave someone behind to find yourself, you know, peace isn't found in drama. It's found in clarity. Subscribe, hit the like button, and remember, sometimes the bravest act is simply walking away.